From a distance, it looked like any other barn on the high plains. A tired structure of weathered timbers, silvered by sun and scoured by grit, hunkered low against a vast and indifferent sky. To the few who passed on the lower road, it was a landmark of quiet failure, the last remnant of a homestead that had claimed another family. Nobody looked at it for long. Nobody saw the thin wisp of smoke that sometimes rose from a hidden pipe behind the rear wall, a plume so slight it was often mistaken for a dust devil or a trick of the light. They saw an abandoned place, a monument to hardship. But beneath the surface, under the packed dirt floor where horses once stood, something was already changing. A different kind of life was taking root, one that did not fight the prairie winter but instead burrowed into its heart, seeking a truce. If you have ever wondered where true sanctuary lies, stay with this story. It is not found in walls that stand against the world, but in the quiet spaces that yield to it. For the two sisters who lived there, that barn was not an ending. It was a promise, a secret kept between them and the deep, patient earth. They did not speak of it. They did not have to. The truth of it was in the dirt under their fingernails, in the shared ache in their shoulders, and in the steady, even rhythm of their breathing as they slept through the coldest nights, protected not by wood or stone, but by a simple, profound idea. The world above could rage, but the world below held its peace. It waited. And Mary knew the cold. Not as an idea, or as a season, but as a presence. It had a weight, a voice, a memory. It was the cold that had taken their mother a winter ago, a rattling cough that settled deep in her chest and never left. It was the cold that had taken their father just months later, a sudden stillness in his sleep one bitter morning, his face peaceful but his skin like ice. They were 18 years old, twins born in the spring, now left to face the winter alone. The cabin their father had built was sturdy, its logs chinked with mud and moss, but it was a creature of the air. It breathed the same thin, sharp atmosphere that surrounded it. Last winter, they had huddled together under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the dark, listening to the timbers of the small house groan under the pressure of the frost. The fire devoured wood faster than they could chop it, and its warmth was a fleeting guest, a small circle of comfort in a room that belonged to the encroaching chill. Every morning was a battle. A battle to break the skin of ice on the water bucket, a battle to coax a flame from stiff kindling with numb fingers, a battle to move limbs that felt brittle and foreign. The cold was a thief. It stole the heat from the hearth, the strength from their bodies, and the hope from their minds. They remembered their father's words, spoken not to them but to himself as he'd worked to seal a crack near the door frame. "It finds a way in," he had muttered, his voice a low rumble of frustration. "Always finds a way," they understood now. The cold wasn't just outside. It was a hunter, patient and relentless, and their small cabin was no fortress. It was a trap. The signs came early that year. The aspen leaves turned a brittle, desperate yellow and were gone in a single gusting afternoon, leaving the tree skeletal and stark against the pale sky. The creek, which usually ran clear and loud well into the fall, grew sluggish and then one morning was caught in a silent, solid sheet. Birds that should have lingered for weeks vanished overnight. A different quality of silence settled over the land, a deep, listening quiet that felt like a held breath. And Mary worked without speaking of it, but the urgency was a third person between them, a constant companion in their chores. They harvested the last of their meager garden, the potatoes small and hard in the unyielding soil. They spent days patching the chinking on the cabin, forcing a mixture of clay and dried grass into every conceivable crack, their fingers raw and scraped. They banked the foundation with mounds of earth, hoping to insulate the floor, but the ground was already hardening, resisting the shovel. The woodpile, which had seemed immense in late summer, now looked terrifyingly small. Each log represented a measure of warmth, a unit of time they could purchase against the inevitable. Mr. Henderson, the man who ran the mercantile in the settlement 10 miles east, stopped by on his way back from a trapping run. He was a kind man, his face a roadmap of other people's worries. He looked at their small cabin, at the two of them standing there, and his expression was gentle with pity. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This winter's going to be a bad one. I can feel it in my bones. Sell the place for what you can get. There's work for you girls in town." He meant well. His logic was the logic of the world. But the homestead was all they had left of their parents. It was their ground, their history. To leave it felt like a second orphaning. "We'll manage," Anne told him, her voice betraying no emotion. He shook his head slowly. "Some things can't be managed," he said. "They can only be survived. And this place ain't built for surviving what's coming." The idea did not arrive in a flash. It came slowly, quietly, born of weariness and a moment of accidental shelter. A fierce gust of wind, sharp with the promise of ice, had driven Anne from the woodpile into the barn. Inside, the air was still. The great wooden doors, though ill-fitting, cut the wind's cry to a low moan. She leaned against a support beam, catching her breath, the familiar scent of old hay and dry earth filling her lungs. The barn was colder than the cabin, a cavern of shadow and chill, yet the wind could not find her here. Her gaze drifted downward, to the floor of packed dirt beneath her feet. It was dark and solid. On an impulse, she knelt and pressed her bare palm against it. The surface was cool, but it was a neutral coolness. It lacked the biting, aggressive frost of the ground outside. It was just earth. Still. Patient. She remembered her father, years ago, digging the root cellar, a small pit in the corner where they stored potatoes and carrots through the winter. He had remarked on it then, a passing observation she hadn't understood. "Funny thing," he'd said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Free solid up top, but you go down a few feet, and the earth just holds its own." Steady, the words returned to her now, not as a memory, but as an instruction. The earth holds its own. She stayed there for a long time, her hand resting on the ground, feeling the faintest sense of something that was not warmth, but the absence of bitter cold. It was a constant. The wind could howl, the temperature could drop, the snow could fall, but a few feet down, the earth remained itself. Unchanging. She thought of the animals that burrowed, the badger and the fox, who understood this principle without thinking. They did not build walls against the winter, they went under it. That evening, by the weak light of a tallow lamp, she looked at Mary. Her sister's face was pale, her lips chapped, a familiar weariness in her eyes. And didn't need to explain the fear. It was the air they breathed. "The floor in the barn," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not frozen." Mary looked at her, uncomprehending at first. Then, a flicker of understanding. A slow, hesitant nod. The plan was not spoken. It was agreed to in the shared silence, a desperate, fragile seed of an idea planted in the frozen ground of their fear. Their work began in the barn's most shadowed corner, a space shielded from the main doors, where old harnesses and broken tools lay covered in a thick blanket of dust and forgotten hay. They cleared the area, moving with a quiet efficiency that had become their language. The floor was hard-packed earth, compressed by years of animal weight and human traffic. Pry bars were useless. They took turns with a pickaxe, breaking the surface crust. The first few inches were the hardest, shot through with frost. It was jarring work, the shock of each blow traveling up their arms and into their shoulders. But then, something changed. The earth softened. The color deepened from a pale, dusty brown to a rich, dark loam. It smelled alive. They switched to shovels. The rhythm was simple, brutal. Dig. Lift. Carry. They filled buckets and hauled them out behind the barn, dumping the earth in a growing pile that they covered with brush to avoid notice. They worked in shifts, one digging while the other rested or tended to the cabin chores. Their world shrank to the dimensions of the growing hole, a space that was first a shallow pit, then a hole deep enough to stand in. At 5 feet down, the air changed. The wind that moaned through the barn's timbers could not reach them. The temperature was constant, a cool, cellar-like stillness that felt like a mercy against the biting air above. They were not digging a hole, they were carving out a sanctuary. The walls were their next challenge. The soil was mostly clay, stable enough, but they feared a collapse. They began hauling stones from the creek bed, a task more punishing than the digging. The rocks were heavy, slick with ice. They used a small handcart their father had built, loading it with as many as they could manage and then, together, pulling and pushing it up the slope to the barn. They were not masons. They had no mortar. They simply stacked the stones, fitting them together like a puzzle, the largest at the bottom, the smaller ones filling the gaps. It was slow, painstaking work. Lift, place, adjust. Lift, place, adjust. Their hands grew calloused, then split and bled, but they bound them in rags and kept working. They were building more than a wall, they were building a belief. With each stone set in place, the idea became more real, more solid. They framed a low roof with salvaged timbers, laying thick planks across the top and then covering them with a layer of oilcloth they found in the loft. Finally, they piled the excavated earth back over the planks, creating an earthen roof a foot thick. They left a small, square opening, building a crude ladder down into the darkness. From the floor of the barn, it was just a dark patch in the corner, easily covered with a scattering of hay. Inside, it was a room. Small, dark, and smelling of damp earth and stone. It was their secret. It was their hope. Mr. Henderson returned 2 weeks later. He brought a sack of flour and another of beans, refusing any payment. His eyes, kind and filled with a weary sorrow, swept over their small homestead. He noticed the woodpile was smaller, their faces thinner. He saw the large mound of fresh earth behind the barn, barely concealed by the dead branches they'd thrown over it. He frowned, a crease of concern deepening between his brows. "What's all this digging?" he asked, his voice gentle, avoiding any tone of accusation. He gestured toward the pile. Mary, who was standing closer, answered before and could. Her voice was level, calm. "Just reinforcing the foundation. Father always said the north wall was weak. It was a plausible lie, but Mr. Henderson was not a man easily fooled. He had seen too much of how people dealt with desperation. He looked from the pile of earth to their worn, dirt-stained hands. He knew they were not reinforcing a foundation. He suspected they were digging a grave, or something close to it. "Girls," he said, his voice dropping lower, full of a heavy paternalism. "This is no way. People get sick from the damp. The earth moves. I've heard stories of cave-ins. Of lung fever from sleeping in the ground. A proper house, with a good fire, that's what keeps a body alive." His words were stones, each one meant to build a wall of reason around their foolishness. He was not being cruel, he was being practical. He was speaking the collected wisdom of the frontier. But his wisdom was for the world above. It had no meaning for the world they were building below. And met his gaze. "We appreciate your concern, Mr. Henderson," she said. And that was all. There was no argument, no further explanation. The conversation ended. He left the flour and beans, shaking his head as he walked away, a figure of conventional reason departing from a place that no longer obeyed its rules. His visit left a chill behind, a cold more piercing than the wind. It was the chill of doubt, of being misunderstood. The whispers in the settlement would grow louder now. The two sisters on the ridge, alone and strange, digging in the frozen dirt like madwomen. Their isolation was no longer just geographical. It was complete. The storm did not arrive. It materialized. One moment the sky was a sheet of bruised pewter, the next it was gone, replaced by a churning, vertical river of white. There was no horizon, no land, no sky. There was only the snow, falling not down but sideways, driven by a wind that did not howl but screamed. It was a physical presence, a solid wall of force that slammed against the tiny cabin, shaking it to its foundations. The temperature, which had been hovering near zero for days, plunged. It fell past 10 below, then 20. The very air seemed to crackle and shrink. Inside the cabin, the cold was absolute. It was no longer a seepage, it was an occupation. The fire in the hearth, fed with their precious hardwood, seemed to produce no heat. It was a frantic, desperate flame, its light and warmth swallowed by the immense cold of the room. A bucket of water, set only a few feet from the fire, began to film over with ice. The timbers of the cabin contracted with explosive cracks, like pistol shots in the roaring silence of the storm. Frost bloomed on the inside of the walls, intricate, beautiful, and deadly. Anne and Mary knew, with a certainty that required no words, that Mr. Henderson had been right. The cabin would not be enough. Staying here was not a matter of endurance, it was a matter of time. The cold would win. It always won. They gathered what they needed, the last of the tallow lamps, a flint and steel, the driest kindling, 2 bedrolls, and the remaining sack of dried apples. They did not hurry. Their movements were slow, deliberate, a ritual against the chaos outside. Each step was a final farewell to the world above, to the small home that had held their entire lives but could no longer protect them. They opened the cabin door and were thrown back by a blast of wind and ice that stole their breath. They fought their way across the short distance to the barn, heads down, leaning into the gale. The world was a blinding, suffocating vortex of white. Inside the barn, the sound of the storm was slightly muted, but the force of it still rattled the great doors and whistled through 100 gaps in the walls. They did not linger. They went to the corner, brushed aside the hay, and lifted the heavy wooden trapdoor. A draught of cool, still air rose to meet them. It was the breath of the earth. One by one, they descended the ladder into the quiet dark. Anne, the last one down, pulled the door shut above them, sealing them in. The scream of the wind was gone. The contrast was immediate, absolute. Above, the world was being torn apart. Below, there was only stillness. The roar of the blizzard, which had been an all-consuming reality moments before, was now a distant, muffled drumming, the sound of a faraway battle that had nothing to do with them. It was the difference between being in the storm and hearing a story about it. They lit the single lamp. Its soft, greasy light pushed back the darkness, revealing the small, 10 by 10 foot space. The walls of fitted stone were solid, unmoving. The earthen ceiling above them felt like a protective hand. The air was cool, the way a cave is cool, but it was a living temperature. It did not attack. It did not steal warmth. It simply was. Anne held up her hand and saw no plume of frozen breath. Mary, unrolling their bedding onto the dry earth floor, let out a long, slow sigh, a sound of tension leaving a body that had held it for months. They had no fire, only the small, steady flame of the lamp, yet the chill did not bite into their bones. The deep, immense thermal mass of the planet surrounded them. The earth, which had been their antagonist for so long, the frozen, unyielding ground they had fought for every potato, for every fence post, was now their shield. It was absorbing the fury of the storm, protecting them within its deep, slow heartbeat. They ate a few of the dried apples, the silence of the small chamber broken only by the soft sound of their chewing. They could feel the vibration of the storm through the soles of their feet, a faint tremor from the world above, but it was a reminder of their safety, not their peril. Later, wrapped in their bedrolls, they lay side by side in the gentle dark. They did not speak. They listened. They listened to the quiet, to the absence of the wind scream, to the steady, even sound of each other's breathing. For the first time in a year, they were not fighting the cold. They were not bracing against it. They had simply stepped out of its way. They slept. It was a sleep deeper than any they had known in the cabin, a peaceful, untroubled surrender. While the blizzard raged above, freezing the world solid, the two sisters lay sheltered in the heart of the earth, and were warm. The storm broke on the 4th day. The wind died first, leaving behind a silence that was more profound than the noise it replaced. The world was buried, transformed. When the sun finally appeared, it illuminated a landscape of impossible white, sculpted by the wind into waves and dunes of snow, all familiar landmarks erased. In the settlement, people emerged slowly, like survivors from a shipwreck. The toll was grim. Several outlying cabins had been lost, their occupants found frozen. Livestock had perished in their pens. The cold had been a killer, swift and indiscriminate. Mr. Henderson's first thought was for the two sisters on the ridge. Guilt gnawed at him. He had known they were unprepared. He had warned them, but he hadn't forced the issue. He had let them stay. Fearing the worst, he gathered 2 other men and they began the long, arduous trek through the deep drifts, their progress painfully slow. When they finally reached the homestead, their fears seemed confirmed. The cabin was a tomb of ice. A drift of snow was piled halfway up the door, which was frozen shut. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sign of life. A heavy sadness settled on the men. "Poor girls," one of them muttered, his breath a thick cloud in the frigid air. Mr. Henderson's gaze swept the property, landing on the barn. On a desperate, illogical impulse, he pushed his way through the snow to its doors. He forced one open with his shoulder. Inside, it was dark and colder than a grave. He called their names. "Anne. Mary." His voice was swallowed by the vast, empty space. Silence. Then, a faint sound. A scuffling, from the far corner. He moved toward it, his heart pounding. He saw the disturbed hay, the dark outline of the trapdoor. He knelt, his knees cracking in the cold, and pulled it open. He peered into the blackness below, calling their names again, his voice now tight with a mixture of fear and hope. A moment passed. Then, a voice floated up from the earth, calm and clear. "Mr. Henderson?" It was Mary. A light appeared below, the soft glow of a lamp, and he saw their faces looking up at him, pale but peaceful. They were not just alive. They were well. He could not speak. He could only stare down into the small, warm-looking space, at the simple beds, at the stone walls. He was looking at the answer. The impossible, simple answer he had advised them against. Word of what Mr. Henderson found did not spread like wildfire. It moved slowly, quietly, like a deep current. He did not tell the story with excitement, but with a kind of hushed reverence. He spoke of the cabin, a frozen shell where no one could have lived. And then he spoke of the small room under the barn, of the still air, of the absence of fear on the sisters' faces. He described not what they had built, but what they had understood. People listened. At first, there was disbelief. It went against everything they knew. Survival meant bigger fires, thicker walls, more blankets. It was a battle of addition, of piling on more defenses against the outside. The sisters' solution was one of subtraction. They had removed themselves from the battle entirely. Men who had spent their lives fighting the prairie winter began to look at their own land differently. They looked at their barns not as shelters for animals, but as roofs for a deeper shelter. They walked their property, stamping their feet, feeling the ground not as a surface to be built upon, but as a space to be entered. A few of the more practical, less proud, families began to dig. They did not announce it. They worked quietly, like the sisters had, hauling dirt and stone, creating small, subterranean rooms beneath their barns or sheds. It was not a rejection of their homes, but an augmentation, an admission that their wooden walls were not always enough. They were creating a place of last resort, a haven for the storms they knew would come again. The sisters offered no advice. They sought no recognition. They simply went on with their lives. But they were no longer seen as strange or foolish. They were seen with a new kind of respect, one reserved for those who see the world not for what it appears to be, but for what it is. They had not been digging a grave, as Mr. Henderson had feared. They had been digging their roots deeper into the land that had tried to kill them, and in doing so, had found a way to live. In the end, this is not a story about construction. It is a story about perception. The solution to the sisters' problem was not invented. It was discovered. It had been there all along, waiting in the constant, patient temperature of the deep earth. They survived not because they were stronger than the winter, but because they were humble enough to listen to a truth older than any cabin, a wisdom known to the seed and the hibernating bear. They did not conquer the cold. They simply learned its limits. They found the one place it could not go. We spend so much of our lives building walls, trying to keep the harshness of the world at bay. We insulate and we fortify. We believe safety is a fortress to be built. But sometimes, true sanctuary is not a structure at all. It is a principle. It is the understanding that the greatest forces in the world are not to be fought, but to be accommodated. The sisters did not defeat the storm. They bowed to it, and in bowing, they found a space beneath its rage. Their simple room of earth and stone was more than a shelter, it was a testament. A quiet declaration that the answers we seek are often not in a loud, heroic struggle, but in the silent, observant act of finding our proper place. If you look closely at the world around you, at the challenges that feel insurmountable, perhaps the solution is not to build a higher wall. Perhaps it is to find the quiet space that already exists, the place of peace that lies just beneath the surface of the struggle. Look down. The earth holds its own. It is steady. And it is waiting.